Do you have something to confess?
No.
Are you sure?
Yes, I'm sure.
So you do have something to confess.
Well, people make mistakes.
Sure, but don't you feel guilty?
Should I?
Yes.
Well, occasionally I'll hit someone with my car, so sue me.
Welcome to It's About Nothing. Okay, Cameron, do you know where actually that script is just all made up actually.
I had no idea.
Yeah, except for the last line. I took that from another television show because today's topic is about blame and error and when people make mistakes. Can you guess where that might come from? I'll give you a clue. It's from a sitcom, and it has been made in various countries as well. So it's been made across the world.
Ah, okay. I want to say The Office, but
you got it.
Oh, really?
You got it. I tried to get the original David Brent.
Yeah.
But actually, it was the American version. Michael Scott is the character played by Steve Carell.
That's right.
Yeah, and it's actually quite amusing. Like, it's a completely different show, I think, from the UK office.
It is quite different, yeah.
But there's certainly some very funny one-liners, and I do like that one because it popped up in the sort of Google search, and I thought, no, that's an interesting one. You know, it's it sort of leads to our topic today, which is around blame. And I think that was actually a long time ago when we first discussed about doing a podcast. We were actually, or a podcast or a webinar, we were thinking about doing something around, is it okay for people to make mistakes? That was a kind of the initial thought, wasn't it? That was one of the topics we thought is, you know, we live in an environment today where if you're basically told, look, you have to make mistakes. It's good to make mistakes. You learn from the mistakes. But then, of course, when you do happen to make terrible mistakes, people don't like that very much. And they want, sometimes they call for you to stand down, to resign. Depending on the type of mistake, the consequence, you can be liable. So we have kind of contradictory messages. On the one hand, some mistakes are okay, and then other mistakes we don't tolerate at all.
Yeah, and we've seen a little bit of that in the public domain, like fairly recently. Like there was the head of Australia Post stood down, I guess, making a mistake or gifting watches to members of her senior team.
So that's actually an interesting one because I don't know too much about that one, but yeah, I wouldn't mind your view on that because as someone who runs a business, I kind of go, if I'm very happy to give bonuses. I like the idea of it. I think it's good to incentivize people and encourage them. And of course, money, giving someone like a cash bonus at the end of the year or something is one thing.
Yes.
But for some reason, do you think it's because it was watches, or is it just the whole idea that it was just a bonus in general? What is it?
Yeah, I think the fact that they were Cartier watches and that, you know, sums up or brings up a certain image that really had everything to do with it. So the cash value, I think they were sort of, some watches were $3,000, others were $5,000. So if those sort of cash bonuses had been given to executives, that would not have raised any eyebrows. Mm-hmm. It came up in Canberra in the Senate estimates process. But what it really gets to is this kind of strange entity that Australia Post is, without sort of getting into the weeds there too much. But it's a privately operated but publicly owned sort of company. So ultimately the Australian government's the shareholder of it and own it, but they don't have nothing to do with the day-to-day running of it. So they've appointed sort of, you know, private industry people to do all that at arm's length. And sometimes that ambiguity gets complicated. So if Christine Holgate had been doing this for a publicly listed ASX company or, you know, some other sort of private entity company, no, it would not have been an issue. So it's and then there was, you know, the initial thing of like she temporarily stepped down pending an investigation, but ultimately what probably clinched it was the Prime Minister, who's head of the government, went in really, really hard on it. Head of the number one shareholder, if you want to put it that way. So she presumably felt her position was untenable. But like what it gets to in another way of looking at it too is often, we talk about blame and mistakes. Often the actual mistake might not be so serious. It's often the way people respond to it. Like if they refuse to take accountability or whether they play it down in the initial stages, often that makes it much, much worse. So sometimes taking blame really, really early, if blame should be taken, is much better than playing this sort of denial game in the long run. And then, often from a PR point of view, people will wait to see what the public reaction is and then sort of judge their response. So in a way, they're not responding, in a sincere way to whether they, really feel they are to blame for a situation at all. They're sort of waiting to see what they can get away with, to put it cynically.
Yeah, so in that situation, you're describing this kind of like you're getting punished really for not being transparent or not being honest rather than for making the mistake.
Yeah, I mean, it's partly that. It's a little bit different, but it's partly that Watergate idea that the cover-up is worse than the crime, as if there is a cover-up involved. So if you get into the business of denying or, there's obviously outright denial in the sense of lying, or there's failing to disclose something as well. And then that's often worse than the initial, indiscretion.
Do you think as well as even if like something happens which is a mistake, but it's not a big deal, but it's something that you should perhaps own up to and say, look, I've stuffed up. I don't know how it happened, but this is what's happened. That by not doing that, and let's say you hide something, that you also call more attention to the mistake, and also it might, but implicitly tell the other people who are looking at the mistake, wow, this is bigger than I thought, because they are concealing it. If they're willing to conceal it, then it must be really bad.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I often, there's probably a few that come to mind, but often in, political scandals, there'll be maybe 2 or 3 stages of it. So there might be an initial revelation, and then, maybe some responsibility is taken, maybe no responsibility is taken, or a little bit. And then, journalists, frankly, will get the scent and dig further and investigate further. So often in, media management, the person might be counseled to sort of like take full ownership of it now, like to sort of come clean or, divulge everything early. But then humans being what they are, that very often doesn't happen. Like that sort of pattern seems to repeat itself again a lot in public life.
So then there's also this issue where people don't want to come forward to admit mistakes because of the consequence, because of what happens. So a good example, and this is probably something we'll discuss with our guest today, is looking at what happens, for example, where let's say, for example, you're working in an industry where safety is very important, so like a safety critical industry, and you're out on site and you do something, you make a mistake, and you're like, oh God, like that was stupid of me. But at the same time, it's actually valuable to know about the fact that it happened. So it might have been a near miss, right? So it might have been that you were about to step out onto a railway track, or there was a handrail that you stepped over to complete a task because it was faster, and then you almost fell over the edge or something.
Yeah.
You might argue that it's actually valuable information for that person to kind of go and tell others and say, look, this is what I did and this is what happened, and it was a bad call, and if we do this in future, then we might be able to avoid it.
Yeah.
If that person's been told we've got zero tolerance, if you are seen breaching the rules, you're off the site. You never get you don't learn from that.
No, that's true. That's true. And I get, like, it could be a great learning experience, because it could be, it was sort of an OH&S thing, and someone says, look, I didn't use the handrail going down the staircase, and I slipped and hurt myself a little bit. And well, that's so easy to do. So make sure that, everybody doesn't make the same mistake I did, and people, like, I remember. But then there can be, feelings of hypocrisy, perhaps, like if people feel that leaders aren't, walking the talk, and that they're being held to a standard that the leaders aren't themselves holding themselves to, then that can be a big problem. I remember very clearly when I was a political staffer, Peter Credlin, who was the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, had the culture was there was a very low tolerance for staffers who, misbehave, for want of a better word. So, if you sort of behave in an unprofessional way, and I think most of us respected that. And then at one point, she was booked for drink driving.
Yeah.
On budget night. So actually recorded slightly above that, that 0.05 alcohol, and and took the rap for it. Absolutely admitted that she was wrong and all that sort of thing. But I think there was some feeling for junior staffers, perhaps, that, or she'd held people to one standard and then she went to sort of transgressed herself. So that can be a problem in leadership, absolutely.
Yeah, and there's a fine line as well, because if you can create that environment where people feel as though there's not a lot of flexibility, that's actually has an impact on the culture as well. So people feeling, worried about saying things or making mistakes, and then that, might lead to a bit of resentment as well, that you feel like people are micromanaging you perhaps, and they're looking over your shoulder a bit.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I think one thing that I find interesting too is the idea of discussing failure, perhaps, owning failure. We have a sort of corporate culture and other professional cultures, this idea that we learn from our failures, and that learning can be formative, and that's all great. But I often find that people don't really follow up on that. No one really wants to talk about failures they have most of the time, and that's sort of understandable. But let's face it, we all have various setbacks at different stages of our careers and our lives in different ways, and we often think of them as something that they happen early on, and that maybe by the time we get into the stride of our career, mid-career, whatever it is, they don't happen. Well, that's not true either. You're gonna have setbacks at various points of your career, and perhaps there is a culture perhaps of celebrating our successes, which I think is fantastic. It can be quite uplifting, but not many people sort of go and discuss their failures in that same collective way and what we might learn from them. They don't show them off, obviously.
Yeah, it's funny because when you think about what humans are wired to do, failure or problems like making mistakes, it doesn't feel good. And then you think it's actually such a powerful system to be a human being, or even an animal, right? Because you get this feedback, which basically tells you you've got to adapt and change.
Yes.
And that's the whole thing that pushes you through and makes you better. So I guess that's the concept that the organizations kind of appreciate. Most people appreciate the fact that you make a mistake, you learn from it, and therefore you
it's adaptability. In fact, even the fact I'm calling it failure is it's putting a certain value on it. Sometimes, I'm saying failure, sometimes it might just be things don't go according to plan. So you're changing tack slightly, or a project, you realize you can't continue with it for whatever reason, the needs just can't be met in the service you can deliver. So it can be various things. So perhaps getting out of that really binary mindset, can be useful.
Just before we call Gemma in, I was going to talk about a different type of mistake. And this is probably a more topical one, because you and I were going to discuss, we're going to have an election podcast at some point when all of this madness, so for future reference, I guess it's probably obvious if you download the podcast, but 13th of November in Friday, in 2020. Maybe for historical purposes, it might be interesting to listen to in a year from now, but we're in a situation where we pretty much know who the president of the United States is, but we're not 100% sure, because not technically, I think it's not official.
Well, we know, I think we know, but I mean, according to Donald Trump, it's not settled. The election goes on. So I suppose it depends what your perspective is.
Well, actually, that's a good, so what I was going to talk about besides the election, it was actually the mistake that was made in the polling in the lead up to the election. And what I find kind of fascinating is that I've seen, probably you have as well, we've seen so many times the polls being so wrong, not just slightly off by 1 or 2%, but sometimes completely in the opposite direction. And, for some strange reason, when it came lead up to this election, there were still experts looking at the polls saying, "Oh, this is going to be a landslide victory," and I was watching it thinking they're so confident that these polls are right again, and I was thinking surely what happened last time should make us think we should be extremely cautious about accepting what these polls will say.
Yeah, I suppose like we're almost in a position to be able to do this, but I'm not sure how wrong the polls are going to be at the end of the day. Like there's certainly some are wrong in some cases, particularly at individual states. But at the end of it, we're going to have Joe Biden win the popular vote by about 5 million, something like that. And he's got a real majority in the electoral college, so it's not like the year 2000 where it's this really close run thing. And there's individual states with, quite small majorities, and there will be recounts here and there, but none of them, as far as I know, are down in the hundreds or anything like that. I think the smallest one is sort of, between 5 and 10,000, and the others are sort of sitting around that point. But in terms of, there was a lot of talk about landslide and blue wave, and I think the expectation was that there'd be this blue wave on election night. And one of the interesting things about it is not so much the final result, but how we got there. So it was so slow. So I almost look at it as more of a blue tide rather than a blue wave, because at the end of it, I think you see a fairly convincing Democratic victory, not a landslide. Like a true landslide would have been a bit bigger, and it would have secured than the Senate probably, and it would have done a few other things as well. But it's not a close run election either. It's a pretty convincing one. And as you know, the polling industry, particularly in the US, is a very, very big industry. It's worth a lot of money. It got egg on its face in 2016, and they went back apparently, and they revisited their methodology, and they believe they identified the margin of error and sort of corrected for it as much as could reasonably expected, and all that sort of thing. So when it all sort of comes out in the wash, I suspect that
you think they'll be closer, so it won't be as off as what we initially thought.
I think it won't be as off as we initially thought, but at the same time, if we put this together with a whole bunch of other polling mishaps, if you want to put it that way, in the last sort of 5 to 10 years, I think we should be a little more skeptical about polling in general. And like, here in Australia as well, like we had this political culture between sort of 2010, 2018, really, where we were, changing prime ministers several times, partly because of news poll, not just partly, like, quite strongly because of news poll, like one particular poll, but other polls as well. And the political class, at least, were really convinced that these polling figures were rock solid, and that they should be taken into account, even in terms of changing a leader midstream. So you might remember when Malcolm Turnbull first became Prime Minister, he went and gave a press conference at Parliament House, and he actually cited the fact that Tony Abbott had, lost.
That's right.
However many news polls it was in a row. And that was a bit of a slip, because first of all, he set himself to that standard too.
So that target, didn't he?
Yeah, he kind of undid himself from the start there. But he sort of revealed an insider logic, people behind closed doors, they don't like to say it in interviews or whatever, but they were paying a lot of attention to these pollings. And then because, Scott Morrison won the election last year in quite an upset and really defied the polling, although, some people would argue the polling was closer than we realised. But one healthy thing that's come out of that is, I think, that our obsession with polling, at least on a fortnightly basis, has dissipated a bit. It's still in the mix, but it's not like it was, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, well, one of the things that is interesting about it was a lot of people were saying with the presidential election that if you look at the margin of error that they put into the polls, then they actually weren't off at all. You have to factor in the error that they never published the error margin, which is kind of an odd thing as well, because you can get away with a lot by saying there's a huge margin of error, really. I mean,
yeah, I'm sure you can for people like me, because I'm not a statistician.
Yeah.
So, but I have to, review these things or whatever. So people just say margin of error. All right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you're giving me your insider.
Well, let's say, I'm not sure. I had to look at the figures closely, but let's say you said Joe Biden is going to win this by 4%, like one of the states by 4%.
Yeah.
There's a 6% error margin. That basically says, well, Trump could win then because it could.
Did they really have 6% error?
I don't know. I've just I had to look. I think this is probably something for our election podcast. I think.
Yeah.
We have to look at the figures.
But they'll very typically have 2%. And then they'll very typically, at least say in Australia with two-party preferred, which is the poll, the indice, if you like, that really determines an election outcome. They'll often be within 2%. So 49-51.
But but I guess the idea is well, it depends on what the error margins are, but there's a certain level of needing to, like, what are they actually predicting? That's the main thing. Are they predicting who's winning, or are they predicting the degree to which they win? Because if we just stand by the fact that, well, technically they were all right because most of them, with one or two exceptions, predicted Biden would win. So therefore the polls get a big tick. But in many ways, what we're interested in is more of the nuances, aren't we? Like, if you're going to break it down by state and say how much this person's going to win by, but then the other person wins that state, but then you get the other state right, you start to look at that and go, look, to what extent is this actually, to what extent are the sports bet odds as good as the polls, which don't require you to go out and poll people, because the sports bet, if you watch that, that seemed to be quite on the mark all the way through. Of course, they were not doing it. Well, I suppose they were. They did change,
though, didn't they? They sort of changed midstream.
They did on the day of the election, but in the lead up, they just said, look, the odds are on Biden to win. But
one thing the polling will do over there is, going in, it should identify key states. So there'll always be certain states that are key states, like usually Ohio and Florida and Pennsylvania. But then this year, unless I missed it, like, I didn't expect Georgia to be such a key state. That obviously had a number of electoral votes, but it's very safe Republican. But then on the other hand, Texas, which is also meant to be very safe Republican, that was mooted as a state that might flip. It didn't. Although I think the Democrats made some headway there. But yeah, it's an imperfect science.
Well, yeah, they did. And the question is, if the polls are really good, they're almost 100% right, then why even do the election? You could just probably look at the poll results, couldn't you, and just say, this is, when it gets that good. But, I got to kind of, like, before we wrap up, I don't know, like, I've always kind of found the polls to be a little bit, maybe they're not the best thing to do at all for any country, because having this constant, it's almost like doing lots of mini elections in the lead up to the election, which don't have an impact, of course. But it's like, if they have an opportunity to influence and change things when they're not 100% accurate. So in that situation,
that's the concern. Yeah, if you start governing by the polls, and the other thing, maybe this is a topic for another day, but also governing by focus groups, which Kevin Rudd was doing a lot, I think. Not to say he's the only one, but sort of that you're, like, creating policy as you go. Like, on one hand, it sounds really healthy and democratic, right? You're sort of like touching base with a sample group of the population, but then what do you really stand for? What's your overarching vision? And the sort of more traditional form would be just you get elected, you govern the way you want for 3 or 4 years, and then you go back and say, look, done a good job, re-elect me, and see what they say.
There's, just before we move on, there is something that's kind of a bit worrying about this constant measurement of performance, because if you think about it, just a good example is like what happens to a lot of small businesses online where they've got reviews. That system, the review system, can be corrupted very easily, where you could be, say, running a restaurant, and a competitor could basically give you a 1-star review to pull your rating down. Now, they've got systems in place to challenge the reviews and where they see those things happening. But it's not, you could be in a situation, for example, which seems a little bit unfair, where you could be running a really good, say, like a really good restaurant, really good customer service, and you just happen to have a customer who comes in who's just a bit prickly and just doesn't like something.
Yeah.
And sometimes people aren't really fair in their ratings. Like if they've had a bad time, they won't say, oh, look, I'll just give it a 3 out of 5 instead of 5 because it wasn't as good as I hoped. They almost out of revenge give it a 1 star, knowing that the average will be pulled down.
Yeah.
Like it's not, you're not getting good data really. And then it seems very unfair for some places because often those like restaurants and small businesses rely on almost perfect ratings, like even eBay businesses, because you're competing against people with 4.9 scores.
Well, it's pretty anecdotal. And like most people who write a review are motivated by extremes, right? So if they have a great experience, they might decide to go and share that. And we've done that when we've been traveling. And then conversely, if they have a really negative experience, they'll write something bad. And I don't even think I've done that. I think if I have a bad experience, if it's really bad, I'll take it up with the management directly. But otherwise, I just want to move on.
Well, I've got another concern as well, which is that if I put something negative, which occasionally, if I've had an issue with an organization like, like a service provider like Telstra or something, I'll pop on Facebook to try and get attention if I can't access anyone to talk to.
Yeah, I've done this, like so on Twitter or something. I've done it for airlines, and they get back to you very promptly.
Yeah, it's the last sort of the final straw. If you can't get on the phone to someone, it's like maybe they'll listen. Yeah. But in terms of writing the reviews and things like that, I don't like the idea of it. For one reason, one simple reason is that I have my own business, and the last thing I want is for somebody to go, oh, I wonder where this person comes from, and do a bit of Googling, and then cause problems, call up on the phone or write something on social media or something. So I figure it's best, just to quarantine yourself from downvoting people. Yeah. Now the one last thing, sorry, it was the reason why, aside from those voting, right, was there was an episode of Black Mirror. I don't know if we've discussed this before, but it was on so this is a series on Netflix. And they had this really interesting one, which was terrifying, but it almost looked like it might be true in the future, where everybody basically goes around and gives each other scores in every single social interaction. And based on your score, you're able to access certain privileges that other people won't be able to get. So, for example, you may not be able to get on a good flight if your score drops below 4.2.
Oh.
And so they go around acting very pleasantly to each other all the time, always constantly worried about what score they're going to get, which looks like this kind of like almost an exaggeration in many ways of what these polls and these online reviews are doing to people, where they constantly feel like they're under performance review.
Well, Uber does that obviously to passengers as well as drivers, which I find interesting. So it turns it around on the passenger a bit. Yeah,
indeed. That's right. And
I have a 4.9 Uber rating, so I'm quite proud of that.
Your 4.9. See, yours is a little bit higher than mine. I only know because I actually called an Uber for the first time in all year, and I was interested. But what was interesting was I was thinking, I wonder why I didn't get, like you probably might wonder as well. I wonder where why it wasn't perfect. What was that person who thought one day, I'm not going to give this person?
I don't know.
What did you do exactly?
I remember one particular incident in Taiwan where I had a driver like at the other side of a hotel entrance, and there was no common language, and I got a feeling that mucked me around for a while, but I'm not. So I can actually isolate it to maybe particular instances like that.
See, but this is the problem, right? And I think this is a good segue into the next discussion, because this is getting back to this idea of not only blame, but the idea that if you feel monitored and always under performance review, and you're not allowed to make mistakes and social faux pas and all that kind of stuff, what kind of world would we be actually creating here? And I think artificially, it means that in election, in lead ups to election, parties can make judgment calls on who's going to lead based on these ratings. On a construction site, it could mean people are fearful about speaking up and speaking their mind, even though it might add to benefits. And of course, if you're running a small business, it might lead you to conduct every interaction you have with a customer on basically stepping on eggshells to make sure that when you walk away, you can get that perfect score. Otherwise, you'll be sitting there worried that you'll go out of work due to a few bad reviews.
Yeah.
So our guest today is it's Dr. Gemma Read. So she's a senior research fellow at the University of the Sunshine Coast. I think that's right. I always go Sunshine Coast University, but that sounds right. Good, good. So she's probably made a very sensible career choice in picking the Sunshine Coast, because that is one of my favorite holiday destinations. It's always warm. It's a little bit quieter than the major cities. And let's face it, today we've all discovered as well that you don't really have to be in a central city, like one of the cosmopolitan cities, so to speak, to do your work anymore. It used to be assumed you had to be in the Melbourne CBD or the Sydney CBD or something. You can now do your work anywhere. And the other week we had Adrian Medhurst on. He was in Byron Bay. So this is a bit of a pattern happening here with our guests. It's making us envious.
Yes, very envious.
So Gemma does basically a systems thinking approach. She's a human factors specialist. So she did her PhD in systems thinking at level crossings, so railway level crossings. And it's something that both Gemma and I have worked on for a number of years. It's kind of a niche area, level crossings. But for those who are listening in Victoria would know all about them, because they're ripping them up. And those who live in New South Wales don't care too much, because they never put them in place, at least in the city, because they had the foresight that they could cause problems. I'm not sure about in Queensland if it's much of a problem there. So we'll bring Gemma in now. We're going to be discussing blame and systems thinking and other topics.
Great, thanks Nick, and hi Cam. How are you guys going?
Hi Gemma, welcome.
Thank you.
So are railway level crossings a problem in Queensland?
Yeah, your first question.
Yeah.
We do have rail level crossings here in Queensland. There are a couple in the urban area, but not nearly as many as you find in Melbourne. And it's probably more the rural crossings that are a concern. There's a lot of cane trains that occur up further north from where I am. And so they run on a seasonal schedule. So, road users aren't used to seeing trains at these crossings. So they have some issues up there at certain times of the year. And then, the same sort of issues with, having rural level crossings that don't have necessarily flashing lights or boom barriers. So just having signage to warn people. I think is a problem, or can be a problem all across Australia. I know New South Wales has a lot of those crossings as well.
So overall, if you're a systems thinking person, if you were to look at the system of, let's say the planet, the whole planet, where's the best use of the money and the resources, do you think, like from a risk point of view? What are the number one? This is a really tough question. Sorry.
Wow, Nick, it's like the second question you asked me. Okay, it's really interesting. It's a very interesting question, and it's funny because recently we actually did a systems model of the world.
Oh, gosh.
To sort of look at what is the overall purpose of the world, and what are all the ways we can measure how well we're doing as a world. And all the functions that we do. And it was really amazing to try and just summarize that sort of on a page. But in terms of I suppose so you're asking where's the biggest leverage point, I suppose, in terms of how we can...
Yeah, that's really interesting though, the fact that you actually did a systems map of the world. Was that just like a bit of a fun project, or was it for something like a proper research paper or something?
It's published. So it was led by my director, Paul Salmon, and he's a big thinker, and so he wanted to kind of tackle these global challenges. Like he says, human factors, we started off in sort of transport and workplaces, but it's kind of got a little bit more broad than that now. We look at sort of public behavior and, things that are outside of that kind of employee organization relationship. And he's sort of looking at, well, how can we tackle some of these bigger global challenges like sort of poverty and pandemics and, all these sort of things, human factors could, like particularly our methods, could actually help with some of these bigger challenges, even if we don't have the kind of scientific expertise in that particular area. The thinking, the thought processes and the methods that we use can actually be helpful to look at that. So that was sort of the idea of, can we actually model, the world? In terms of your question, I think where you would kind of invest or make change, it's really in the structures, isn't it? Like if you want to make a difference, it's in the kind of way that we structure maybe political and social systems. And I think education is a big one as well. Just, you know, giving people access to education and changing mindsets, like the way that people think, can be really, really strong in sort of changing behavior at all levels of system, because that's what we do, is we look at not only the, you know, the people working on the ground or operating, you know, on the ground, but how people operate in organizations and how people operate in politics and things like that. So if you kind of change those mindsets, and you were talking earlier, actually, I was listening in, talking about sort of the media and the public and the polling, you know, like the actual influence or the power that the media have in kind of influencing politics and the way that we do things is really important. And the public then has a role in what media they consume and how they respond to the media and kind of influencing them. So if you kind of change mindsets across the board.
That's actually a really big statement if you unpack it. Like, does that suggest that, you know, democracy sometimes comes up with really messy outcomes, and not just uncertain outcomes, but policy outcomes that aren't always great? You know, if we're looking at a world system idea, so that suggests to me sort of really common good rather than just like individual national interests or sectional interests, then that's really, really challenging, right? So the obvious one is, you know, climate change, but there's others, like the sort of the failure to really have a binding global consensus, even though there's obviously been some headway, you know, made in these areas. It's just, it's very hard to change mindsets, because mindsets often speak to self-interest, frankly.
Do you think, because when you're talking about all of those things, the one thing that popped into my mind as the ultimate leverage point, which is interfaces all those things, is technology. Because you essentially, to get better education and to broadcast it with the media, we've got this sort of mega trend, which is the smartphone and the interfaces we've got. So you essentially can be interconnected with anything. You no longer have to pay for a course to listen to the greatest minds talk. You can hop on YouTube and get it for free. And so I still think we're like at the really the infancy of the internet and the smartphones and everything. Like, we're still the change it's having on society is like it's amazing, right? It's terrifying as well, because all of these discussions that are now happening on social media and people bouncing back and forth, and you know, that we're getting people discussing politics when otherwise they would either have a conversation around the dinner table or maybe with some friends. But now you can hop on a platform and broadcast your views to potentially millions of people all over the planet, and that's just like, you know, amazing, like that could happen. And that the only way that's happened is through the internet and I guess, what is it, smartphones, or is it what's a generic term for that? Computers, maybe?
Yeah, so the smart devices or smart tools that we have now. Yeah, I mean, obviously technology is a huge kind of disruptor in a whole lot of areas. I guess one thing that we often talk about in human factors, and you talk about this as well, Nick, I'm sure, is, you know, the need to see technology as kind of a means to an end rather than an end in itself, and, you know, like actually designing it so with the thought of how people will use this and what kind of unintended consequences could come out of this. And it's quite interesting to see some, you know, there's been some documentaries, people who actually were involved in the development of social media tools and now looking at what some of those unintended consequences have been in society, and saying, oh, well, we didn't really think about that when we were, you know, designing the like button or whatever that is. And I think you can't always predict those things ahead of time, you know, like things come into a system and they'll have these emergent effects that you can't always predict ahead of time. But I think we could probably, as a society, kind of be a little bit smarter about when we are designing things, looking at some of those human values, you know, and human needs, and why do we need this technology? What do we actually want it to do? What kind of values do we need to build into the way that we design it and the way that it will be used, so that we try and minimize some of those sort of unintended consequences.
Like there's a great democratization of information in a way. Like Nick's saying, you can go and access, I mean, you can always buy a book, I suppose, and read that professor's book, but you can go and access a lecture series now and have that experience. But then conversely, there's a a devaluing of information in a way, because there's so much of it out there. And then the idea of expertise, or the idea of like information that's, you know, peer reviewed and based on research being more valuable, just like my opinion on my blog, let alone the whole world of, you know, fake news and choose your own facts and all that sort of thing. So it's really, really messy. And I remember like talking, this is slightly different, but I think related, like talking to someone, like a retired spook actually, so from the intelligence community, like he'd been in the Cold War era, saying back then the challenge was obtaining information, and now that we actually have too much information and trying to work out what is valuable and what's not valuable.
Yeah, I mean, even as just a consumer of information, you know, if you go out and try and find what is the current, you know, knowledge about something, it's difficult, and it's difficult to, it must be very difficult for, I think, young people coming through school and, you know, things these days to make that difference between what is legitimate sort of information and what isn't. There must be a lot of
It is. I mean, I
challenge.
don't know if you teach as part of your work, Gemma, but you know, in the last year, I had been teaching in the university system, and first year students through. I mean, that's something you really do have to guide them through. So if they're writing an essay and, you know, their research and bringing material to it, like what is a credible source and what's not, and you've always had to do that, but it's become more and more challenging.
Yeah, definitely.
So that's out of interest then. So you looked at this system of the world and you're saying, what are we there to do essentially, right? Did you like think about the ultimate sort of product, or what the Earth was there for? Did they figure that out?
It wasn't, we didn't look at an ideal system. It was more trying to model what's currently there.
Right.
So, you know, we included things like conflicts and things like that. I'm trying to remember what the overall purpose of the world was, because we did have quite a bit of debate about that between the authors. And
Good question. That's
I
like
remember that
life.
it was like that, and I think we went with something around supporting human life. And I remember there was debates about it, because it was like, well, shouldn't we also include all life?
Yeah, I mean, that's.
But then we sort of decided, but actually maybe what we're doing at the moment is focused on humans and sort of sustaining human life over all life on Earth. So there was a bit of debate about what we're actually doing versus what we should be doing.
Did you do this exercise like post-pandemic, or?
It was pre-pandemic.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So you discussed the concept of pandemics, I'm assuming.
I have to double check that, but I'll have to get
Really,
back to you on
that's
that.
interesting in itself. Like I remember being in a conference about 12 months ago, and we were given a sort of briefing on the security landscape of the Pacific, but it, you know, and Asia, and it covers a whole bunch of things. But pandemics always on the horizon. But one of the things that was actually previewed was a kind of form of swine flu that was going around the Pacific late last year, and I don't know what came of that. Obviously, like it wasn't even a form that we were worried about mutating to humans. I don't think, but it was killing off a lot of pig stocks in like small Pacific Island countries, and we were like discussing how that's going to flow through to a whole bunch of other things. And then, of course, COVID-19 came along and sort of knocked everything else out of the water.
Yeah, it's always the thing you're not expecting.
Yeah, I mean, it is. But the strange thing is, like, it's completely predictable in a sense, right? Like we know from history that pandemic, like it's just a certainty over a period of time that they historically happen. So it's like, it's not a black swan event. I think I've like shared this view of mine with Nick before. It is quite predictable in a sense. We just didn't know what, you know, the timing and what form it would take and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So when you look at the overall purpose of the planet, I think it's interesting, because I think you have to differentiate between, I think you made a good point. It's not a purpose that's been designed. It's a one that's emergent, right, from the system. So it's like the system is going in this direction. It doesn't actually have a conscience as far as we know, right? I mean, unless there's something we haven't discovered and somehow the Earth has somehow got some conscience, which is, you know, it's highly unlikely. But overall, it seems to be like the system, it seems to, like most systems, it tries to almost maintain what it's doing. And we can't see the bigger picture as to how it's overall, what it's actually doing. It's just emergent. It comes from that whole system. So I kind of wonder, if you look at it from the planet's point of view rather than the human perspective, what is the planet really doing overall? Because we're part of the planet, right? Aren't we? We come from the planet, and we come from stars and things like that, essentially. So what is it really doing? Like when it got started, right? This is probably a very, you weren't expecting to have to answer these sorts of questions today, were you?
I had not prepared for these questions at all, Nick. Thank you. What if, from the perspective of the planet, what is it doing? Well, I'm just thinking, we probably need a, sort of physics expert here or something, but, it's probably about maintaining position in space and maintaining its trajectory in orbit and things like that. You know what I mean? Like, and maintaining its, the atmosphere. Like, I'm just sort of picturing, this sort of.
Yeah, that's not even getting into, like, if you were so inclined, you could have a theological response to that question too, obviously. So, like, different people are going to have, like, vastly different responses to that. And, like, is it James Lovelock, I think, has that theory of, he talks about Earth as Gaia, which I'm not overly familiar with, but he probably would, Nick, say that Earth has a consciousness, actually. So when you sort of get to this level of discussion, I think consensus breaks down in a way, because
no one really knows, right, as well.
No, I think Gemma's right, actually, to go to physics first, because that's probably where I would go.
It's probably safest.
Yeah, I think it is. But then, the consensus breaks down because it gets to people's really beliefs and values.
And I think that's really interesting, because there is diverse views on many topics, and that actually makes for, I guess, a richer understanding of something. So, if you had a panel here of people coming from very different backgrounds, I think you would have a really fascinating discussion about that topic, and it's almost as though you can't explore the topic without those diverse views. If
you kind of look at, there's sometimes you can get some really good what do they call it when they speed up the videos of the Earth? Those
time lapse.
Yeah, and you see stuff and they show patterns, right? And then when you look at it from that level, it's interesting because you almost see like the planet's almost like breathing in and breathing out as over time. And then also the activity of humans as well is an interesting one, where you basically see this absolute flurry of activity when the light's on, and then it starts to slow down, and then you just see a few things moving around at nighttime, and then it starts to speed up again and people are moving around. So when you're looking at those sort of patterns, that's the system, right? You're looking at the broader system going, this is what it's basically doing. And what is that exactly, though? And that'd be... I think it's an interesting one, because that's the most complex thing to look at, aside from the physicists who are looking at the whole universe, which we're not. I don't think we could even get into, even with a physicist. I think our minds would be blown. But there's a different level, which is also very complex, but perhaps slightly less so, which is during, say, pandemics and things. There's a lot of not contradictions, but there's lots of debate about what's valuable. And the problem usually is that there's you get your health fundamentally being, everyone values health, but then there are indirect things regarding health, and it's not just health. Sometimes it's well-being and way of life. So most people, if you said, if you were locked down for the next 20 years, but no one would die, would you accept that? And I think everyone would go, no, absolutely not. I'm not doing locked down for 20 years. But then you might say, what about 2 hours? Would you tolerate 2 hours? And everyone would go, yeah, absolutely. If we can sort this out in 2 hours. So there's a time thing there where I think everyone would there's a tipping point where everyone has a certain value for the sacrifice they're willing to make for a long-term benefit. And that's probably based on not just your health. It's obviously, there's lots of other factors that come into play. But because of the politics, everybody kind of forces, we're seeing it in the media and in different, I guess the different political parties. There's a stronger push for health with, certain parties, and then other parties push economy, and then finding the nuance in the middle, recognizing that, hey, you know what, there's actually, it's not one or two things here. We've got to strike a balance here where there's multiple factors we've got to consider. And then we've got to find a course of action which which gets us through and balances those things appropriately. And that, to me, when I think of that, is the system, right? We're looking at, it's almost like, in this case, it might be the well-being of society or something, the well-being of communities. And you could even, collapse it down to a period of 12 months, the well-being over a 12-month period versus the well-being over, say, 2 years, 10 years.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, you're sort of talking about, I guess, like goal conflicts. So, in every system, you're going to come across these kind of conflicts between multiple competing goals or interests. I guess kind of taking it back to some of the work that I do, like we always see, and you as well, Nick, would see in your work in safety, that conflict between safety and productivity, or safety and efficiency. We're always trying to balance these things, and it's such a difficult task to do, but it's almost even just being aware of it helps the decision-making process. You're kind of aware you're making more, I guess, considered trade-offs between those goals. And then, like you say, things like time, with the pandemic make a difference as well. But I guess you're also trying to then get consensus across a group of people who have different values or different ways that they're balancing those.
Yeah, it's like if you look at animals, like all, throughout history, and we're all products of our ancestors surviving to a point, right? Where that's why we're here today. And there's always been this trade-off, hasn't there? Like, it's like you always have to balance the trade-off. Like, if you look at an animal going out and finding food, which is the opportunity, or staying where you are because you could be gobbled up by something. And the ones who are brave enough to go out may actually survive longer than the ones who stay in, but at the same time, the one who's a little bit too bold will get gobbled up. So we've like inherited these characteristics of basically being, like, I guess, we're ultimately prevention focused and worried about stuff, but at the same time, absolutely, driven to actually get out and actually take risks. And it's almost like this interplay happens non-stop every single day. We're always basically striking this balance.
I think about this one a bit, because over time we've managed to control our environment more and more compared to our ancestors, and we've managed to mitigate a lot of risk, not all risk. Does that make us more risk adverse because we don't have to deal with risk in the same way? So, a few generations ago, my ancestors might have not thought much of getting on a ship and sailing to the other side of the world as a means of transportation. And, there was, childhood mortality was really high. Women went into pregnancy sort of knowing that, whole range of things. So now I wonder whether we become less willing to accept risk in our sort of day-to-day life. I think in some cases, yes.
Yeah, I would agree. I think our tolerance for risk is much different, and something that we've been, I guess, looking at, or the human factors literature kind of talks about, is also as we're less likely to accept risk, just sort of bring us back to the sort of blame topic. When things do go wrong, especially with technology, we tend to kind of really rely on governments and things to protect us. So we're more saying, okay, so for example, some of my research is in autonomous vehicles. And, when something goes wrong with an autonomous vehicle and there's a crash, we're more likely to kind of blame people higher up in the system, like the designers of the vehicle and the governments who allowed it to be tested on the roads. Whereas, if it's almost a similar situation, but it's a human driver, we go straight to blaming the human driver, because we've got someone to kind of blame at the front line there, sort of. So it's quite interesting. So almost like the expectations of how we'll be protected by governments have increased over time, and that puts a lot of pressure on governments to kind of manage risk.
I think hugely. And I think actually government having heightened those expectations, and then from time to time, we've had these really sharp points where it's become clear government can only do so much, and frankly, only reasonably do so much. And then, there's bound to be disappointment. So if you have natural disaster, for example, there's obviously a role for government there. Like, it might be in response and recovery. It might be in partly in preparation as well. But at the end of the day, you know, I don't know, this is controversial, but if you choose to build your home, you know, surrounded by a forest, you've got a heightened chance of bushfire, right? And we've seen cases where people not only do that, but their house gets burnt down and they rebuild it essentially in the same place. And so it's not necessarily the role of government to make sure that house can't be burnt down. Like, government can do certain things by saying, well, you can make a clearing around your house and, you know, regulations and that sort of stuff. But it's hard because government naturally maybe want to appeal to people to, you know, win re-election and that sort of thing. So it's very easy for government to maybe sort of reassure people and say, oh, we've got this. But then when push comes to shove and it's not something they can reasonably do, then you get this sort of expectation gap, disappointment.
Yeah, it's, you know what, because technically I imagine it's not possible to eliminate that risk, but it's possible with enough resources, like I'm talking about ridiculous number of resources, to prevent all houses from burning down. For example, a silly thought experiment is that you'd have fire trucks basically parked out the front of every home in the state, as an example. Yeah. So, but, you know, like, it's possible, but I think this is going back to that question again, it's that productivity trade-off as well. It's like, there are certain things you can do, but you don't, you could invest a lot of your time and effort into trying to basically control something, but we make it a choice to say, look, we'll wear some risk though, because we're not going to go crazy here. We're not going to, at some point I'm going to leave my house, because even if I could get hit by a car, I've got to obviously accept that risk.
Yeah. And
it isn't worth investing all my resources in time in managing one risk. And of course, and when you do that, of course, you shift it away from something else anyway, which comes back to the ultimate problem is there's always limited resources, and then we're always trying to find the best way of distributing it.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder if, you know, blame's a very natural thing, really, because like, blame is trying to make sense of something. So if you've got a problem, in assigning blame, it's finding an answer to the situation, trying to make sense of the situation. Like, if my, you know, fence is burnt down or something like that, and I, you know, find that my neighbours set fire to it, I blame my neighbour, but in doing that, I've established how that has happened. So then it's sort of, the problem's solved in a way, or maybe I have to deal with my neighbour then. I have a very lovely neighbour, actually. She's a retired naval officer, so I don't imagine she's going to do that. That's an aside. But then perhaps also, like, in assigning blame, do we naturally sort of like trying to push it away from ourselves, like even subconsciously, I suppose?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because I guess the way we would say, you know, sort of talk about, you know, trying to avoid assigning blame as you know, when something's gone wrong, you know, we want to know what happened and why it happened. Yeah. And like you say, Cam, like, we might jump to assigning blame because that kind of closes it out for us. It gives us an outlet. It, you know, allows a kind of simplistic causal association. You can go, okay, well, that person did that. But really, you know, from a kind of broader system view, we want to learn why that happened. So we want to know, well, why did your neighbour burn down your fence? You know, is it something that you did, or maybe they're annoyed about something else and they're taking it out on the fence? You know, there's a whole lot of questions. So before you kind of jump to that blame, you actually want to go, okay, well, let's try and, you know, understand why first. And you might even try to empathize with your neighbour about why that could have happened. And what so one of the human factors professors, Sidney Decker, he talks about putting yourself in the shoes of the person. So, you know, how do you actually say, instead of with hindsight and from our own position, sort of trying to objectively say, oh, why might that person have done that? You actually try to say, okay, well, what did they know at the time? What influences were they facing? What pressures were they under? And really try to, and then obviously ask questions about.
There was a concept in the Cold War, but it exists today as well, or perhaps it should have, strategic empathy. So in the sort of rivalry between the US and the Soviets, like, there are a couple of times when they got very close to having nuclear war, obviously. And what sort of pulled them back from the brink was each side, like, actually sitting down for a minute and thinking, what are they really doing? What assumptions are they actually operating on? What would I do if I was in their shoes, and that sort of thing. And at some points they were very good at doing that. At other points they were quite bad at doing that, and things got worse than they should have. But ultimately, that sort of thinking probably pulled both sides back from the brink. And in fact, the Soviets, I'm probably simplifying it here, but at least in the latter part of the Cold War, the Soviets were better at it than the US. They were the ones to cool ahead a couple of times.
Yeah.
So it's interesting about, so the blame one, right? So like someone does something wrong, it's kind of like, as a general principle, we're saying it's always good to find out why that happened, and we don't want to just blame people. But of course, in practice, there are some things we're willing to tolerate mistakes for, right? So we'll say, I give a good example is what was happening. There's a really good example in Victoria when people were breaking rules in lockdown. The government basically said, we're not going to fine them because we want them to actually tell us and actually collaborate with us. So if we make them afraid, then they're not going to collaborate. And we're all worse off, okay?
Yeah.
But at the same time, they had a contradictory policy, which I'm not saying is wrong or right, because I'm not sure how you solve this problem because it's very complicated, where if you didn't have fines in place in the first place, then it makes their decree of the lockdown basically completely ineffective, because you've got to have some sort of penalty in order for the public to at least take it seriously.
Yeah.
But at the same time is that then they weren't willing to apply it in these situations. And it seemed like I could imagine being in that situation, if I was working in government, thinking, oh, I think we're just going to have to do this. I can't think of a better way of doing it. Other than pay people, give them incentives to stay at home and do all of that, which,
that was the idea of incentives was discussed by at least one expert. Like there was, I remember someone talking about actually sending masks out to everybody and then having almost like a social credit system where if you did what they wanted you to do, you get a voucher for something or this or that, which was interesting. It would have been very expensive. But back to what you said, Nick, like, yeah, but I think also there was, without going into the details, like too forensically, there was inconsistent enforcement at some times. So there was fines issued in some cases and then quite publicly fines not issued in others. And I think without arguing the merits of that in particular, it makes the overall legitimacy of it more difficult.
But indeed. But so like, let's take an example like this one, like a hypothetical one where someone didn't follow like a lockdown rule and then they infected lots of people who died, for example. And I know there was an example over in the US. There's lots of them, of course. But there was a story that made me kind of go, oh gosh, this is pretty serious. I'd hate to be in this scenario. Was this guy was in the US and he didn't believe that the virus was real. And so he had his family around and he was encouraging all his family to meet. And then I think his father-in-law and his father-in-law's mother died after getting infected. And it was, it's a terrible, like you hear these case studies and they make it a little bit more real and you kind of go, whilst it's very unlikely that you'll die, it would be horrible to be in that situation where you felt as though you encouraged that. But at the same time, you would look at blame differently here, because you'd kind of go, all those people had a choice. They didn't have to go to the family thing. The virus is also very unpredictable. And really, ultimately, that's the causal factor, the virus. He didn't go and murder them directly. But there's a level of responsibility that he was talking about, which he felt the guilt. So obviously he felt like he played a part. Now you would look at that situation very differently. And first of all, you'd probably go, look, let's talk about this. Let's discover what went wrong, or let's discuss how we could make improvements without restricting people's freedoms too much. But then on the other hand, if somebody commits like a horrible murder or something, I can also understand the argument where people are like, I don't really care why they did it or what happened here, and they've got to be blamed and they've got to be punished for this. But if you're very hardcore on like, no, don't apply blame, and the system, generated this person because of their background and their genetics, and anyone would have done the same thing had they gone through their life experiences. Then you start to go, you end up in this very interesting philosophical thing about free will. And And then you start to go, well, do people, do they actually have free will or not? And I don't think we'll be able to resolve that one, by the way.
When Donald Trump was talking about using disinfectant internally, something, like that, like a cleaning. And then I don't know whether these reports were really verified, but there were, kind of reports in the media about some people actually going and ingesting disinfectant because he, said that. So if someone got ill from that or, heaven forbid died, do you blame Donald Trump for that? Like, you and I look at it and conclude that he's an idiot and that no one should follow that advice. But is that, yeah, I don't know.
I think it's interesting what you were saying, Nick, because in organizations we talk about just culture. So we sort of say, if someone makes a mistake or takes an action that ends in an adverse outcome, we don't just, there's sometimes that you might blame or that you might place responsibility on that person, and other times that you wouldn't, and you take into account things like whether they intended to whether they engage in reckless behavior, whether someone else in the same position would have made the same type of mistake and things like that. And you can kind of go through a bit of a decision tree to say, well, is this just something that the system created and anyone in that person's place would have done the same thing? Or is it something that that individual kind of brought to the situation and there was some intention or some recklessness that actually requires a level of accountability and, perhaps responsibility? But Nick, you're taking that out into the public domain, which is really interesting, and saying, all right, well, let's look at this from the sense of everyday people who aren't trained, they're not selected, they're not really controlled by an organization. And it's just, I don't think I have an answer, but it's just a different kind of approach. And like I said before, it's kind of like taking human factors away from or some of its principles from where it was kind of developed and out into the world, and seeing if that works.
Yeah. So ultimately that person has to live with what's happened.
Yes.
Okay. That's what it really gets down to.
I think in that case, definitely.
You have a conversation about negligence or criminal negligence, I suppose, but ultimately it'd be really interesting to know what that person's conscience said to them. And that's like a completely different discussion in a way.
And I think there's also talk, and I mentioned Sidney Dekker before, but he talks a lot about the second victim. So, someone who has, made an action that ends in a terrible consequence, like in that case where he lost his parents or his parents-in-law.
And
he sort of talks about with a lot of these cases, we shouldn't necessarily be looking at retributive justice, but more restorative. So, everyone's kind of hurting in that situation. So what could be done following that actually kind of restores justice somehow? And I think this person's come out, they're talking about it in public, they're educating others about what happened, they're sharing their grief. And I think in that sense, that kind of restores or that goes away to kind of, atoning for that behaviour. So without needing any additional kind of judicial kind of justice. So, but there's so many different factors. And earlier, Nick, you were also talking about fines, which I guess they're there for deterrence purposes. They're trying to stop the behaviour. So it's all, I guess, a bit of a mix of what are we trying to achieve before or after an event, and what's the best way to go about influencing people so we get the outcome that we want.
Yeah, because sometimes, like that example, is that person was organising a family event is it's just a normal thing to do, really. It's to organise this is where it's such a, I mean, I'm sure all the philosophers at university are loving this right now in a way, because they've got so much material to discuss, because it's very complicated. And I'm not sure, I don't think in this case study it was prohibited to meet as well. So it's funny how
that's a good point. Yeah.
Is it worse if it's prohibited or not? Is it bad, because a rule was broken, or is it bad because bad judgment was used? Or is it not bad at all because they were just all organising a family gathering, and unfortunately there's a virus out there and we're all taking risks? So there's lots of different perspectives I think you could have by looking at something like that, where you don't have a direct cause and effect relationship, like where, maybe if he'd made the dinner and he knew that the food was may have been contaminated, but still made a decision and thought, it should be fine. that maybe you'd say, well, that's actually a lot worse.
Yeah, I mean, there's enforcement and rules, but there's also public education. So I think most of us, almost everywhere in Australia at the moment, is seeing a lot of COVID, safety signs, and it's not just about fines and enforcement, but it's telling you what to do and what not to do. And I'm not entirely sure, like in some parts of the US, I think that's basically not happening. It certainly is in some, but not so much in others. So if that individual's not, really surrounded by public education, or at least receiving a level of public education, that it does put a different light on it, I suppose. And then I wouldn't be surprised if this also feeds into that person not trusting the information they are receiving. So they might, view what we can, like mainstream media, and just dismiss that. So if this person believed that the virus was a hoax, that the virus literally did not exist, then, it's hard to reason with that person possibly.
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? Because it's almost like we going back to Gemma's example of the vehicle, as like if you're physically in control of it and it's direct and it happens, then it seems to me it's a lot easier to go, there was a problem. It's a lot harder when you're further removed from the actual risk. So if, for example, you look at the leaders all around the world are dealing with a problem, in some places, thousands of people, in fact, hundreds of thousands have died because of policy decisions potentially, or maybe not. It's hard to know. Like it was inevitable, or maybe there was a way of reducing it. Who knows for sure? But nevertheless, when you make the policy and then it has a flow-on effect, and then people die, you kind of go, is that much worse than like one person, say, killing another person in a fit of rage? Where only one person died.
Yeah. And like just quickly, while the thought jumped into my head, going back to what we were talking about with the election before, and I guess blame and public accountability, which was democracy, comes into it. And one like strange, but perhaps not all that surprising thing out of the US election was that in many cases, states where COVID rates are currently really high and mortality has also been quite high, Trump did quite well. So there's a whole heartland of America where COVID has moved into now. Like I know the Midwest, for example, Trump won a lot of those states. So whatever we might think about the COVID response, and I'm very critical of Trump and his administration's COVID response. I think it's a lack of a response or a coordinated response. Not everyone agreed with that for various reasons. So,
just out of interest, I was listening to something the other day about how people were saying essentially that they're actually really surprised at how people in Britain and in Australia have been so compliant and have not sort of questioned things and have just sort of fallen in line so much, whereas the reputation, I think it was a podcast I was listening to, someone from the UK was saying, the Australians think that the people in the UK are going to be like stiff upper lip and we're not just going to listen to what the government says. We're going to do what's sensible or something along those lines. And they were saying that in the UK, we were thinking the Australians would be much more boisterous and protest a lot more.
I'd like to hear from Gemma on this, but before I'll just jump in quickly. I think there's partly a misunderstanding of national identities. So we tend to think of the British as still being the people of the Blitz, and they're not necessarily that at all. Like it's that, that was a particular time in history and all that sort of thing. So you do see a little bit of that Blitz spirit. Like the Queen's address earlier in the year was a great throwback to that sort of era. And I think that's a strand of feeling in the UK, but it doesn't represent everyone. And here in Australia, we like to think of ourselves as very relaxed, knockabout, laid back people, but we're not really. I think we're quite rules orientated. And someone said to me recently, we like to think of ourselves as the descendants of convicts, which some of us are, but we're also the descendants of prison guards. Yeah. So there's sort of two strands going on there.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I think part of the relaxed attitude though does I think does work towards, you know, but we're also, I think we're possibly quite a well-educated nation as well.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, I don't have stats to back that up, but I think, you know, we tend to, you know, have good high school leaving rates and things like that, and a pretty good education system. So, and we're probably less on the questioning science area compared to perhaps the US and some other places. So I guess in that sense, you know, we do have a level of trust when experts are telling us certain things, and we do kind of listen.
We're pretty familiar with public health messaging too.
Yes,
like
yeah.
We get that pretty regularly, you know,
yeah.
in a coordinated sort of way. And I don't think the Americans get that much at all.
Yeah.
When my our designer came from Colombia, and when he came over, he was asking all these questions about, can you tell me a little bit about the rules in Australia? Because I know that Australia has very, very strict legislation and rules around what you can and can't do. And I was like, really? I didn't realise. And you know,
I think we're quite highly regulated. Yeah.
In relation to COVID or in general?
No. This is a long time ago. So it was in general. It's like, and you know, probably a bit of a concern around the police, and they're going to be watching and all that kind of stuff. And that was the reputation that we had.
I didn't know that.
Well, that's obviously one person's view, but I thought that was interesting because I was like, well, of course you don't know if you live in Australia most of your time, because that's your main experience, isn't it? So you think everything, like the speed cameras and all the stuff that's out there, you grow up with it thinking, oh, that's fairly normal.
Yeah,
I think also we get known for it when people travel here because of our customs and biosecurity restrictions on entering the country and things like that. And I think for a lot of people who travel internationally, you know, come here for the first time, they haven't seen that before. So
it's a reality check when you come home too, because if you do a bit of traveling, you go from country to country, and it's really quite easy going in, and then you get home and it's just a reminder, as soon as you arrive, there's all these checks and the dogs and border force and that kind of thing, and you're like, oh yeah, that's how it is.
Now, just before we wrap up this part of the segment, then Gemma, is there anything you're working on, anything of interest that you wanted to share that you think people are interested in?
I guess, well, it's kind of lots of things, but there was one thing I did want to kind of mention, I guess if this is my chance to mention something that I wanted to, was about the language. And this comes back to Cam talking earlier, I think you as well, Nick, before I came on, about failure and like, should we, you know, not use that language? And that's something that I'm really kind of keen on seeing people kind of getting away from the negative language around human error, you know, using words like violations. I'd love to see, you know, just more neutral language around, you know, someone took an action or someone, you know, made a decision, and we don't necessarily have to go into whether it's, you know, what kind of standard we're comparing it to, and that it was a failure, but more just to kind of understand where that came from, and where it is, you know, if it did lead to an adverse event, I guess where in that kind of the many causal factors that led to that, we could actually make change, like where's the best leverage point. So we are actually looking to do some work into, I guess, a bit more around where are the best leverage points, and are they the same across different types of systems? So like a transport system versus maybe a societal system, like we've been talking a bit more about today. Like I'd love to do a bit of work around that. And there's some really cool work by Danella Meadows, who is sort of public policy academic. And she had some fascinating work about those leverage points, and she had sort of a list of what the key ones were. So actually that's where I stole my mindsets answer from. Hers was about, well, it was actually about the biggest leverage point you can have is changing paradigms, or being flexible with the paradigms that you apply. So actually looking at things from different perspectives. And that's, kind of the key thing, but kind of, and then she goes down into more sort of rules and taxes and, you know, all those other leverage points. But I just find that area fascinating, because it's more about not kind of what went wrong, but kind of how we improve and go forward and kind of optimize systems.
I think that's really interesting.
It's just on that, just to wrap up, I think something that I was thinking recently that probably aligns with those views then was, there's a tool that we often use, Gemma and I would use, you might have heard of it, Cam, the hierarchy of controls. And essentially, you know, it's to eliminate risk if you can, if certain risks that that are not tolerable. And then you want to engineer it out with some sort of physical infrastructure, so engineering, And then as you move down the hierarchy, you get down to what they refer to as administration, which is essentially changing processes and procedures and putting up signs, but almost essentially putting the decision in the hands of the user. And usually in human factors, we try and remove the decision away to reduce error if it's something that's safety critical. So you don't want someone deciding whether a train should go through a signal if it's quite clear that further down the track there's people working on the track. Ideally you'd remove that, and the system would basically prevent you from running trains through there.
Yeah.
So, but what I was thinking was, based on the mindset thing, was that we often in safety circles, in risk workshops, there's always this focus on, we've got to engineer out. If we can't eliminate, we're going to focus engineering. But the longer term thing is actually administration, or at least education and changing the person. If you are able to do that, if you're able to change the person or the way that they think, and over time, then there might be a greater flow-on benefit. Maybe not immediate, because that individual could take many actions in their life, which might have a much bigger effect than just that one risk you're trying to manage. And so there's this sort of flip around where people go, education doesn't work because over time we've shown that it doesn't reduce risk. But in many ways, you could argue it takes a lot of investment, but changing the way people look at things and analyze things and understand things could have a much bigger impact overall, I guess.
Yeah. Just a couple of things on that, Nick. I just wanted to mention I'm kind of using the hierarchy of control a bit less. So like it's a bit like what you're saying. Like I've kind of changed my views around that a bit, partly because it feels like it's very much a humans are the problem focus. So it's hierarchy of control because we can't trust people to do things well. So let's engineer them out, and that leads us to automation and a whole lot of design decisions that reduce meaningful work for people, reduce the ability to adapt, and what we're talking about before, learn and improve, and actually be able to recover from incidents as well, which humans do really well. And yeah, it just kind of comes from that bit of that kind of, humans are the problem type approach. I think it's interesting what you're saying about education. I'd probably reframe that a little bit to talk about building expertise. So it's not about just awareness and education and telling people what to do, but it's actually kind of
building
building their whole capability and building up expertise. And I think that is the answer. And actually, we need people to have the opportunity to make mistakes in order to build that expertise. So if we kind of come back to the positive side of human error or making mistakes, you need to actually expose people to situations where they can make mistakes that don't have adverse outcomes, I suppose. So a safe space to do that. And, in aviation, they use simulators and things like that to put people in those difficult situations. And I think that's a really nice thought, Nick, that we could actually focus on improving the job design and the work and the way that humans work. And you could have all these other emergent effects from that.
Absolutely. That was really good. Thanks, Gemma. I know we tackled some pretty tough topics there. We talked about
we put Gemma in the deep end.
I know that was. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. But I'm actually quite pleased though that when I asked that question, you actually had a case study to back it up. You actually said, we're looking at that right now. I think that was quite handy. Yeah. So very good, and that wasn't planned. I think that was almost a fluke.
Oh, thanks very much, Nick and Cam. That was heaps of fun.
Thanks, Gemma. Enjoy the rest of your day. See ya. Bye.
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 All right. So we're wrapping up. Now, what do we usually do? We usually go through what are we reading or what are we watching? And
reading, yeah. Have you got anything?
I'll let you go first.
Okay.
I haven't been reading.
I've got a reading one again because I haven't done a reading one for a while. And actually, when I say reading, to be honest, I'm doing a lot on audio. So I'm listening when I go on my bushwalks and that sort of thing. And I've decided to revisit Gothic horror. So some of these are new to me, some of them aren't. But I read or listened to The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson last weekend. It's relatively short. I think it's maybe you call it a novella or a longer short story. It's maybe 2.5 hours or so on audio. I'm planning to do Dracula next, which I think is significantly longer. And
Bram Stoker's
like most people listening will be familiar with one way or the other. It's the story of Dr. Henry Jekyll, who is in London sort of in the 1880s, and he's a medical man, but he's into transcendental medicine, and he starts experimenting, and he sort of begins by alienating his contemporaries around him, who thinks that his experiments are increasingly weird and he's very eccentric, and they're a bit worried about him, but they don't realise how worried they should be. And he's made the decision that he wants to be able to kind of separate the bad from the good, so to speak. So there's one side of his character that he believes is good and wholesome, and that's the public side that everybody sees. He's a very upstanding member of London society. And then there's another side that is low and base and acts on vices and urges. And he doesn't really go into a lot of detail there, but you get the impression that he likes, partying pretty hard and, yeah, sort of along those lines. So, as you do, his way of dealing with this is to create a sort of an alter ego that literally like comes out of himself. And this is Mr. Hyde, Edward Hyde.
How did you come up with the name, by the way?
I don't know, actually. That wasn't, unless I sort of missed that in the passing, but that wasn't really fully explained how he comes up with the name Edward Hyde. But Edward Hyde physically emerges from Henry Jekyll. And Henry Jekyll, by the way, is a tall, sort of striking man. And it's described that Mr. Hyde's smaller and somewhat younger looking, but appears to be deformed in some way, but no one can quite put the finger on the deformity. But he's the kind of man that when he walks into a room, a chill goes through them. They don't quite know what it is about this man, but he puts them off very, very easily. And so for a time, Jekyll lives this sort of double life where he turns himself into Hyde, at night, and goes out terrorizing London and all that sort of thing. But what he finds is over time, he loses control. So he wakes up one morning, he's gone to bed, having turned back into Dr. Jekyll. He wakes up one morning as Mr. Hyde. So without taking the potion, without going through he's gone through the metamorphosis, I suppose, but not in a consenting way. And he realizes over time he's losing himself to this other side, and that's the direction the story sort of goes in, that he's fighting this losing battle. And it's really interesting from a lot of ways. Like the first thing that comes to my mind is that difference between our public life and our private life, I suppose, in a really sort of binary way. And particularly, it's written in the Victorian era in England, right? So it's really the high point of we talk about Victorian morals and correct conduct and all that sort of thing. But we know from our history that a lot of that was about public face, and that people behaved very, very differently behind closed doors. And to some extent that was tolerated as long as it didn't become public. So that's a big part of it too, obviously. It's interesting, like I was telling my partner about it from a horror point of view, and he said, well, that doesn't sound very scary. And it's not scary.
It's more intellectually interesting.
Yeah, it's horrifying in the sense that it's morally repugnant, if you want to put it that way. So from a medical point of view, when his contemporaries find out what he's doing, it's almost like, oh my God, you're playing God. You're literally like altering the rules of nature here and doing things that even if humankind can somehow develop the means to do this, we shouldn't touch it. So that's what's horrifying about it, I suppose.
Yeah, well, that's obviously a similar sort of theme to, Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
Very similar, yeah.
Playing God. I think, when you're talking about that, I was thinking it's very Jungian as well. It's basically looking at the yin and yang and how we've got, essentially we've got, according to Jung, we had like two sides to ourselves. And I think I don't know if I've mentioned this one to you before. I always remember this example, which was, if you were to sort of hold a bird in your hand, not the saying a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, and that's not where I'm going. But if you hold a bird in your hand, you go, you have an impulse to nurture it. At the same time, there's a part of you which feels like it could slam your fist down and crush it.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
And you're basically somewhere in the middle. You're not really either of those two things. And I think what that's getting at is this. Maybe it's an unconscious thing about how, and which is always, which is a common theme in literature and films and everything, of this idea that people have a darker side to them.
It's interesting that you raise Jung in that context too, because my understanding is he sort of pushed the limits of psychology in some of those ways. Like I'm not sure transcendentalism, but there's a spiritual side to Jung's writing, isn't there?
There is, yeah, that's right. Well, that's why I think more and more contemporary psychology, because it's moved much more into the scientific method and looking at observable things, that a lot of the Jungian stuff is kind of a curiosity, but it's not prominent in any of the
I was always fascinated by, I've read a little bit but not all of it, like he had concept of synchronicity, like he believed that if, like in coincidence, I suppose, like if a certain string of events happened and lined up with each other, therefore there was some force probably that's suggesting that something should happen. There's almost like predestined, and for a scientist that's unusual, I suppose.
And of course, he's one of his colleagues, the most famous psychologist of all time, Sigmund Freud. Basically, all the things you're talking about he was living in that era where people were repressing a lot of their impulses, and he believed anyway that this repression of kind of the of their sort of fundamental, their kind of what he called the id.
Yes.
The id is very much Mr. Hyde, repressing Hyde inside you.
Yeah,
that creates anxiety and mental illness. And I'm not sure. It'd be fascinating. It'd be actually a great idea for a story or a movie. Bring Freud back into 2020 or 2019.
What do you make of
the internet and
brain behavior,
and the obsession with sex and all that stuff? All the stuff he said, he talked about. Back then, it was very taboo to talk about it. But today,
it's a good point. I mean, there certainly are taboos, but there's way less, fewer taboos now than there were in his time, obviously. And in fact, in reading this book, I kept sort of thinking to myself, well, what exactly is it that Edward Hyde is doing that's so terrible? And I suspect he was consorting with prostitutes, perhaps, maybe drugs. It was probably opium in London at that time, but most of what he was doing, wouldn't necessarily be that controversial these days. Yeah,
well, there's a good. I'm a really big fan of David Lynch. I don't know if you've ever watched any of his stuff, but there is definitely a theme in all of his movies and television shows is this idea of the facade of society, and then underneath there's the truth is underneath, and it's a lot dirtier and not very nice. And more recently, they made a third season of Twin Peaks, which is my favorite TV show.
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah, and it was and he made it very almost literal in this one. They had the main character, Agent Cooper, who basically is split down the middle into two characters, and one of them is basically completely pure and unadulterated and just not, I wouldn't say perfect, but just like an innocent child. And then the other part of him is this almost like what you were describing, the Mr. Hyde character. He's completely off. There's something wrong with his eyes, the way he talks and everything. It's just something very sinister. And of course, he does horrible things and sinister things as well throughout the entire third season. And then, and it's probably this idea of it's almost like the show it was a commentary on human nature in a way, to say we've got these two components, but then when they can come back together, they might actually make a more whole person. That person may not become a killer when he's got the other part combined. It might does
the bad character become worse, or is it sort of a level of?
No. It's like essentially they described him behind the scenes in terms of the writers, and I think the actor is Carl McLaughlin. I think that Lynch described him as a shark. Essentially, play him like you would imagine a great white shark would think or behave, and so completely emotionally neutral. These sort of black piercing eyes, completely focused, and get out of its way. Basically, you can't reason with it. You just have to move aside.
I think Hyde becomes worse, like without sort of telling the whole story, he does move to murder. Although because it's such a famous story, there's been many adaptations of it on screen and stage, I think, too. So I think that angle of it's played up in some of the reproductions. Yeah.
Do yourself a favour and either watch it on YouTube or on television if you can find it. There is an absolutely appalling Mr. Hyde character in the latest Mummy film, which no one watched, with Tom Cruise.
Okay, I haven't seen the latest Mummy film.
Yeah, and it basically Russell Crowe plays Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Yeah,
and it's just terrible, and you've got to watch it. And the movie was a massive flop. And they were trying to start their own sort of Marvel universe, and they were going to have Johnny Depp as the Invisible Man, and Tom Cruise was the Mummy, if you can understand how that works.
Well, they must have spent a lot of money, like with these big stars. Like
they had this whole franchise set out. They were going to have the Invisible Man one with Johnny Depp as his own standalone film, and then they were going to have them all come together as characters, like they're doing with the Marvel universe.
Yeah, okay.
And it was just really bad. Really
I
bad.
enjoyed the original Mummy movies back in the day.
Oh yeah, the Brendan Fraser ones.
Yeah, they were good.
Yeah, they were entertaining. But certainly the Tom Cruise one is. I haven't watched the whole thing. I don't think it's worthy of watching the whole thing. It's just
okay.
Now we might wrap up. Mr. Hawker. And I think, what worked quite well in this podcast, just to say, just for future reference, there was a few coincidences like the Jungian ones.
Yes.
I had that our terrible sketch at the start, which had you talking about hitting people with your car, and then Gemma quite conveniently talked about autonomous vehicles. And so
I was expecting a knock on my door from the police now that I've been with my car.
Yes, indeed.
All right.
Enjoy your day. Chat soon.
Yes, you too. Bye for now.